They're outlining her case. We will get to see that videotape a little later in the trial. Right now, though, Rob, I want to ask you, is it important that Aileen Wuornos, and just in case you don't know, Lee is Aileen Wuornos. I'm sure you figured that out by now, but she calls her Lee. That is her nickname. Is it important that she's represented by a female in this case?
I don't know. I don't really put much stock into that. Some people think that, you know, having a female attorney is beneficial to her. It goes, you know, either way.
Yeah, I think it's really just about good lawyering. Thus far, in her opening statement, she's laying out her theory of the case, the fact that she believes it was a self-defense case. But one interesting point that she makes is that she has to deal with the confession, because the bottom line is the confession flies in the face of that theory. And I think she skirted over it. I think she had to pay more attention to what these jurors are going to ultimately see, and that is Wuornos, in her own words, saying that she committed this crime.
Well, it's interesting because you can fight a confession in a number of different ways. One, by arguing that the police improperly influenced the client, because you have to understand that when someone comes in to speak to detectives, particularly when she's been the target of a woman hunt, and such as a case like this, it is an exceptionally coercive environment. Now, put on top of that the outside influence of her lover calling her, encouraging her, you got to say it, you got to say, you got to clear me. It does create a certain coercive environment. And what she's probably trying to do is she's probably trying just to convince the jury that you can't really fully believe everything that was said. In fact, they're going to try to manipulate it to show that it's inconsistent. But really, when you look for the truth, and when you sort through all the other problems and you take out the coercive environment, you can show that it's consistent with what really happened.
You know, prosecutors claim that she told a couple of different stories, and we're going to get to see for ourselves. Again, the defense says you won't see her talk about a couple of different stories, so it'll be interesting to see how that shapes up. But I'm not so sure that's such a bad thing for the defense if she's telling a couple of different stories, because, again, it goes to her confusion. As we heard the defense say, there was some alcohol involved, she was confused, and she's not sure how events happen. And oftentimes, when you get involved in that life or death situation, at least as Ms. Wuornos is claiming she was in, you don't remember exactly what sequence, how things exactly happened. All you know is that the result was this and you got away.
That's where physical evidence comes in. That's where all the forensic evidence comes in, because if you have two separate stories, each very different from the other, and the physical evidence supports one. In other words, if during one of her stories she said, well, I shot him twice and that's it. And in another story she says, well, I shot him twice, then I got out of the car, moved around and shot him twice again. And the forensic evidence supports the latter version. The jury will tend to believe the latter version. And in fact, it seems that that would be the one that actually was true.
Yeah, you know, we heard a little bite from her talking about, you're looking at what I did, but you're not looking at my life. You're not looking at all the difficulties I've had, et cetera, et cetera. What role does that play? As a defense attorney, I mean, you have to consider that a trump card, because as I talked a little bit about earlier, she's had some difficulties, some serious difficulties, which almost can explain her actions to a certain degree.
Pretty amazing, and I do agree with you. I mean, jurors tend to be emotional creatures. They're human beings, and you really want them thinking about the difference between first-degree murder, second-degree murder. We think that she should go to jail for the rest of her life, but we don't think that we should put her to death. She's hitting on something that is very important in this case in terms of mitigating circumstances and should a death penalty be imposed. But even taking it further back, when the jury hears about this woman's life, it is tragic. I mean, these are horrendous, criminal, violent activities. But if you understand where she came from, you almost feel like putting members of her family on trial for letting her live this life. She was abandoned. She was brought up by grandparents who apparently had their own problems in raising kids. She was living in cars at a very early age. You know, early in her teens, she's living in cars. She's a hooker at a very early age, using drugs, turns to family members, creates problems for them, gets thrown out of their lives, and apparently she has this real, you know, hatred for men that you almost can kind of understand, you know, given her background. So she's hitting upon something that is very important. It's up to the jury to decide whether or not that takes away from the criminal actions.
Right. Do you take the chance and demonize the victim in this case? I mean, Mallory obviously was, I won't call him an unsavory character, but he was involved in some unsavory activities, certainly. Do you take the chance and demonize him too? to a certain degree to try to help towards that end as well?
Well, I think you have to, and you have to show that the nature of that particular transaction, and it was a business transaction, and that's the way it has to be viewed, is one that doesn't really lend itself to being sympathetic to the victim. Now, he's dead. He didn't deserve to die. He didn't deserve to be killed. But at the very least, what the defense is able to bring out is that this was a transaction in an isolated place involving alcohol, involving sex. He knew what he was getting himself into, and that is certainly something that you want the jury thinking about.
Yeah, again, it's just any way you can to get them to sympathize with your client can only help, especially when you're talking about a death penalty case. We're going to have much, much more in just a moment. When we come back, we're going to hear from the lover we've heard so much about, really one of the most pivotal characters in this case, Tyria Moore, a lover for about 4.5 years of Eileen